Prynawn da pawb. We'll start in a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for people to join the event this afternoon. Thank you ever so much for joining us. So we'll start on time at 2 o'clock. Just for those who've just joined us, Prynawn da, we're going to start at time at 2 o'clock as people enter the town hall meeting. Prynawn da pawb, we're going to start in a moment. We're just waiting for a few more people who've registered for the call to join us. So if you could bear with us a minute or so, that would be fantastic. Diolch. You can see our numbers creeping up slowly, so we'll start in a moment, everyone. Wel, Prynawn da, croeso i chi gyd. Diolch yn fawr iawn am ymuno wedi heddiw ar gyfer digwyddiad ymgynghori cyntaf Medr ein system reoleiddio newydd. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to you all. Thank you very much for joining us today for the first of Medr's consultation events on our new regulatory system. Really grateful for you taking the time out of your busy diaries to come and hear a little bit about our new approach. I'm James Owen, the Chief Operating Officer of Medr, and I'll be guiding you through today's session. I'm pleased to be joined in our office here by my colleagues, Ewan, Andrew and Cleona from our executive team, and also delighted to be joined by Stephen Marston, a Medr board member and chair of our quality committee. Stephen's online, so will be joining us and talking a little bit and giving some insight into our approach later on in the session. As we go through the session, I'll ask everyone to introduce themselves as they begin to introduce their parts of the presentation. Just a few quick housekeeping points to begin with. The session is being recorded and it will be made available on our website, so you can come back and look at it again, or by all means circulate it to colleagues. Please post your questions into the chat. So we have a facility here that if you post questions into the chat, it will come through to us a minute or two afterwards. We've got 90 minutes for the session, so there should be plenty of time for us to respond to as many of those questions as possible. So as we go through each part of the section and session, please feel free to post your questions. Mae croeso i chi gyflwyno yn rhy gwestiynau yn Cymraeg neu Saesneg, so you're very welcome to submit your questions in Welsh or English. And of course, we're talking today about the consultation documents we published a couple of weeks ago. They're all available on our website, and we will again post a link in the chat to those so you can read them and go back and have a look at them. The plan for today's session, very briefly, is to explain the legislative and policy context for this consultation. We'll then hear from Stephen on his perspective on the thought process involved in developing our new regulatory system and how we've arrived at this point. The team in the room will then provide an overview of the process and some of the key documentation we're consulting on before we focus on giving a more detailed view of our regulatory approach, the intervention powers, and the quality framework. Most importantly, though, it is an opportunity for you to ask any questions of the team here in Medr and for you to hear our responses. So again, please feel free to post in the chat as we go through the session. To begin with, though, just to provide some context to today's session, the consultation represents a significant milestone for Medr. It's nearly a decade ago now since the Hazelcorn review in 2016, which provided an analysis of the tertiary education system in Wales and provided some recommendations for the government to consider in terms of how it may reform the system here in Wales. Ultimately, this led to Welsh ministers taking forward primary legislation in the Senedd, the Tertiary Education and Research Act 2022, which essentially sets out the legislative framework underpinning all of our work, but particularly the work that is relevant for us here today. It sets out our statutory duties to consult on the development of this new regulatory approach, and it also provides the framework for some of the key documents that we published, including things like the quality framework. Following that, Medr, of course, was established in September 2023 and then operational in August 2024. And for the first time, this brought together responsibility for funding and regulating the tertiary education and research sector in Wales in one arm's length body of the Welsh Government. And then a few months ago, we published our first strategic plan in 2025 in March, which committed us to developing a new proportionate risk-based regulatory system by August 2026. And really, that's the purpose of the event today, to focus on the work that we've been doing since we were established and operational to develop our proposals for that new risk-based regulatory system. So the combination of these developments have set the stage, if you like, for our proposals, which we're consulting on and discussing today. And with that in mind, I'm delighted that Stephen's been able to join us, chair of our quality committee and Medr board member. And Stephen, I'm going to hand to you now, if I may, to provide some insight, if you like, into the approach we have taken in developing the proposal set out in the consultation and some of the principles, I guess, that have underpinned that approach. Stephen.
Thank you, James, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much indeed for joining this consultation event. I've been asked just to say a few words about the consultation package from the point of view of a Medr board member and the chair of the quality committee. So I joined the Medr board as a non-executive board member when it was first formed. And so I've been part of the journey that has got us from our starting point to today's event. And from my point of view, I think the starting point in developing the whole regulatory framework is an understanding that we are a new organisation with a new remit given to us by the Welsh Government and the Act, covering the whole of the tertiary sector. This is a first for the UK. So although we do want to definitely we want to use and build on approaches that have worked in the past in different parts of the tertiary sector. And although we are committed to managing the transitions in a way that minimises disruption, it is still very much our intention.
We seem to have lost his connection to Stephen for a moment. Apologies, colleagues. We'll see if he's able to rejoin us. Stephen, we lost you a second, but it looks like you're back. Yeah.
Okay. Apologies, everybody. I'll try again. So I was just saying it is very much
As always with these things, it worked perfectly in rehearsal, but it looks like Stephen may be having some challenges with his Wi-Fi. So Stephen, I think you may be back. I wonder if you turn your camera off, and that may help. Yeah.
Let me turn the camera off and see if that holds the line a bit better. Sorry, everybody. Can you still hear me, James?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay. So, in trying to design a new regulatory framework, the board has tried to apply a number of principles that seem to us important. Firstly, that the framework has to work for the whole of the tertiary sector. In other words,
Okay, it looks like we've lost Stephen for a moment. So
right.
Stephen, if you can, I think Stephen, you're back. Can I suggest, if Stephen, I could come back to you in a moment just to see if the Wi-Fi sorts it out. So if I maybe ask you and just to say a little bit about the process to begin with, and then maybe we'll try again in a moment, Stephen, just to see if the Wi-Fi sorts itself out.
Okay.
Does that work for you? Yeah. So Ewan, if I could just hand to you just to say a little bit about the consultation process before handing back to Stephen.
Prynawn da pawb, fi enw I Ewan Bradley. I'm Director of Regulation at Medr. Just to give you a summary of the consultation process and the timeframes involved, you'll be aware that the current consultation runs through now till the 18th of July. And this is the first phase of 2 formal consultations. We are aiming to have a second formal consultation in the autumn. Now, between now and then, we will also be undertaking informal engagement with the sector as well. So it's effectively a lot elongated engagement process with 2 elements of formal consultation. The feedback we have from this first consultation on the elements of the new system, which has been published, which you've seen, that feedback on those elements will be used to revise those elements, and we will be presenting the entirety of the new system in the autumn. So the second consultation will be a consultation on the entirety of the new system, and you will have the opportunity as well to make further comments on those elements which you will have already seen in this consultation. So it's very much a 2-stage process, and we really do want your views. So as well as being iterative, we are trying to be as open as possible, and we really do encourage you to have your input. In terms of how you do that, you'll have seen there's a link with the consultation that we are collecting responses to the consultation questions using Smart Survey, which helps us to analyse the responses, because we are anticipating quite a large number of responses. But of course, if you also have other views which don't fit with the questions, you are welcome to submit those. And if you've got any other questions, you can also contact us through our email address, which is regulationadvice@medr.cymru.
Thank you. And Stephen, if we may, should we try you again now? Just we're crossing every finger that the Wi-Fi may have just improved in the last couple of minutes. So Stephen, back to you if we may.
Well, thank you, James, and apologies everybody for making this so painful. I have just tried plugging in an Ethernet cable, so keep your fingers crossed that this may be slightly more stable. So what I was trying to say earlier on was the board has approached this as a new organisation developing a new regulatory framework based on a number of principles. First, that it has to work for the whole of the tertiary sector, everything from school sixth forms, FE colleges, apprenticeships, work-based learning providers, adult and community learning, universities and HE providers. And it's got to work in a way that applies consistent principles while still recognising the diversity of institutional type that we're trying to cover. Secondly, that above all, it's focused on the learner. What we're aiming to do is to create a framework that supports all providers across the tertiary system to offer education and training programs that meet the needs of learners and enable them to achieve their full potential. Third, strongly based on a partnership approach. From my perspective, coming from across the border in England, it's one of the most attractive features of the educational culture of Wales that it is based on a collegiality and a partnership that we very much want to apply in developing the regulatory framework. We want it to be data informed. We want to be transparent in the data we're using because we believe it will help all providers if they know the data about their own performance and they can benchmark against others. And also that it's going to be risk-based and proportionate. We will be intervening as and when necessary if there is evidence of non-compliance or poor performance. But we very much want to put equal focus on working together with yourselves, with providers, with learners on improvement and enhancement. We're really not only concerned with ensuring compliance with baseline standards and expectations. What we really want to do is work together over time on how we make the whole tertiary system better in the interests of learners. So that's the approach that we've tried to apply and some of the principles that we have tried to use to inform the regulatory approach. Specifically on the quality framework, the Quality Committee has tried to apply the principles I've just summarised in designing a quality framework that will both assure quality and promote continuous improvement. Cleona O'Neill is going to say more shortly about the detail of the quality framework. I just wanted to draw out one particular principle that has been important for us in the Quality Committee. And that is that, in our view, you cannot impose quality and high standards from outside. The achievement of high quality and continuous improvement has to come primarily from within each provider. And it comes through skilled and committed teaching and professional services staff working together and with learners to provide excellent teaching and support. And you'll see that principle reflected in the core of the quality framework, which is the 7 pillars. And if you've got far enough into the detail of our consultation package, you'll find the pillars set out in figure 2 of the quality framework document. 6 of those 7, you'll see, are internal to the institution. So we want all providers to be ensuring that their learners are actively engaged in decision-making within the provider and that the voice of their learners is strongly heard. We want all governing bodies to be actively engaged in developing the institution's methods for quality assurance and its strategy for continuous improvement. We want to see a strong focus on staff development, equipping staff to develop and deliver excellent teaching and support for learning. And we want all providers to be rigorous in their own self-evaluation, drawing on their own data and benchmarking against other providers as a basis for developing their own robust strategy for continuous improvement. So what that bit of the framework is trying to do is get all of those internal drivers of quality and standards operating to full effect. Plus, there's a final pillar, a 7th pillar, that is about externality, drawing on the expertise of peers and fellow professionals from outside the organisation, such as ESTIM and QAA in particular. Final point I just wanted to make from the board perspective is that as a board, we recognise that there is a lot more to do. The consultation package we're discussing today already contains a lot of detail, but there are several proposed conditions of registration and funding which we've not yet drafted, and I think Ewan and Andrew may talk about later. We're still developing the learner engagement code, we're still developing the learner protection principles, and there's a lot more that we need to do to develop our performance data sets and use them to generate real insight into performance trends, gaps, and priorities, so that on that basis, we can start to develop some robust targets for performance improvement and also benchmarks. But I hope we've said enough in this first consultation package to explain how we intend to approach our regulatory remit and the principles that we want to apply. It will remain fundamental to our approach that we want to work in partnership with yourselves, with learners, with providers, with stakeholders, around a shared ambition of providing excellent teaching and support for all learners across the tertiary system in Wales. So I'll stop there and hand over to Ewan. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. So I'll just say a little bit about the timeline for the introduction of the new regulatory system. So, as I mentioned before, we're currently in the first consultation phase, which runs through till July. We will then have a second consultation, which runs, we think, from October to December, although the precise timing is yet to be finalised. And between now and then, we will be engaging with the sector more generally, even outside of these formal consultations. And then this all then leads up to the introduction of the new regulatory system in 2026. For those providers who will be seeking registration onto the Higher Education Register, they will apply in spring 2026 for registration. So then there will be a period during which time we will consider those applications. And then those providers will go onto the register when it goes live from the 1st of August 2026. And at that point, most of the conditions of registration come into effect. And at the same time, we're also planning that the new conditions of funding will also come into effect as well for those providers who are not going to go onto the register. And for those registered providers, there are a couple of conditions which will come into effect later on from August 2027, and those specifically relate to fee limits and to equality of opportunity. So there's a lot to do. This is actually quite a tight time scale. So just to draw your attention to the documents which you will have seen on the website, we have a consultation overview document which sets out all the questions. And as I said before, you can link through to the survey to complete questions and respond. In terms of the actual documents which we're consulting on, the ones we want to talk about today are the document which outlines our regulatory approach and intervention powers, and then also our quality framework. And at next week's event, we'll be talking about the regulatory framework itself. I'd like to say a little bit. Andrew, also over to you.
Thank you, Ewan. Hi everyone, I'm Pickford my name's Andrew Pickford. I'm the Senior Regulation Manager for Medr. I'm just going to sort of touch on our regulatory approach. So our regulatory approach really sets out the type of regulator we want to be and the type of regulatory environment that we want to sort of foster and develop in conjunction and in collaboration with the sector. I mean, the approach sets out how our strategic aims are reflected in how we want to work as a regulator, what are how our regulatory objectives align to those strategic aims. It sets out how our core values will influence our behaviours as a regulator, and again, the kind of behaviours that we want to see and want to foster across the whole of the tertiary sector. Sets out the core set of principles by which we want to begin to establish ourselves as a regulating body, and also an early idea of the expectations that we might have of providers within that environment. Again, of course, these are very early ideas, and we want yourselves to be part of shaping those expectations, both of ourselves as a regulator and obviously your commitment to the sector and to learners. So, as an example, in terms of how our strategic aims relate to our regulatory approach, well, so one of our key strategic aims is to focus the tertiary sector around the needs of the learner. So how we reflect that down then in terms of a regulatory objective, we've tried to think about this in terms of the avoidance of regulatory harm. So that in this example, the interests of all types of learners are safeguarded by preventing poor educational practices or approaches to well-being. And then we take that avoidance of harm kind of principle and engage that into how our regulatory approach will work. So we will seek to closely engage with learners and position their voice centrally within decision making, and also regulate in a way that expects providers to focus on and be attentive to the needs, experiences and outcomes of all learners. I'm not paid a bill, sorry everyone. In terms of our regulatory philosophy, it's sort of underpinned by our values. And as we mentioned earlier, as colleagues have mentioned earlier, we want to be a proportionate and risk-based regulator. We want to, as an organisation that puts learning at its heart and one of our core values, to develop not just rules-based compliance, but also goal-based improvement and continual improvement across the sector. So, striving for improvement as a tertiary sector, as well as a regulator in the way that we do things. As has been mentioned again, we want to be inclusive in the development of the regulatory framework. This is the first phase of our consultation. We have a second phase in the autumn, but we will commit to continuing to learn beyond that. We don't expect to get everything right, and we commit as an organisation, again, with inclusivity and learning at its heart, that we will continue to develop and refine how we work as a regulator. And in terms of empowerment and enabling and encouraging providers to excel, we encourage providers to take ownership of compliance and continuous improvement, with a greater emphasis on self-regulation and risk management from providers themselves. So some of the examples, as I referred to earlier, some of the principles that kind of guide our regulatory approach, and I want to apologize, slightly bullet heavy. I'll just pull out a few examples here. So, for example, we will offer providers clear guidance and resources to support them in adhering to regulatory compliance, but also in terms of striving for continuous improvement. Again, we want to be a learning organisation, and this will be an iterative process in the development of our regulatory framework and the development of this kind of regulatory cultures that we want the tertiary sector to kind of experience and be part of. As Stephen mentioned earlier, through our intervention process, through our regulatory processes, we will intervene where we feel necessary and in accordance, as you will discuss shortly, with the specified and non-specified means that we have at our disposal to intervene. And in terms, again, of our expectations of the sector and of providers, again, I'll pick out some examples on this. We are seeking to move towards a greater emphasis on early self-reporting and self-regulation, such that governing bodies of organisations or equivalents take a sort of proactive lead in managing the risks, the regulatory risks of their provision. We want to develop a system whereby providers are engaged with regulatory guidance, both in terms of, again, that compliance, but sharing of best practice in terms of how we can develop improvement, recognising that engagement is on us in terms of the quality of that guidance and resources, but also expecting the sector to engage fully with that. And where we do intervene, where we have those times at which interventions are necessary, one of our expectations is that the sector would engage with that intervention in the way it's intended, in the spirit it's intended, which is around striving for continuous improvement, to assist and to support the system around the needs of the learner. And now I will hand back to Ewan, who's going to talk to you further about the intervention powers.
Thank you, Andrew. Just very briefly, Medr has a range of tools which can ensure compliance with the various conditions of funding and conditions of registration. Those apply across the sector, but there are differences between different types of institutions as what applies to who, and I will come to talk about that a bit more in a minute. But just to say that our powers do apply to registered higher education providers, further education institutions, external providers, which, as I mentioned before, typically franchise providers delivering higher education, school sixth forms, and also other funded and non-funded tertiary education providers. And there are two types of powers, which I think Andrew mentioned very briefly. Those are the specified powers, which are those powers which are tightly defined within the Tertiary Education and Research Act, such as the issuing of legal directions or publishing reviews, or in extreme cases for registered providers, say deregistration. Those powers which are very tightly defined and set out, but then also other non-specified powers which can be linked to Medr's role, both in terms of the monitoring of conditions of registration and funding, but also linked with our funding powers themselves. So any other sort of actions we can take as a result of our regulation and funding responsibilities. So I'll just say a little bit about the various types of provider and how those different types of powers will apply. This is very much a summary, so there are complexities which are not outlined here, but in a nutshell, for registered higher education providers, so all specified interventions linked to ongoing conditions of registration will apply. So if there's a problem related to an ongoing condition of registration, we can intervene, and there are a number of actions which I'll come and talk about later, which can be undertaken in that context. Additionally, though, there are non-specified interventions that we can undertake linked to both the conditions of registration and our funding powers. If I say a little bit about external providers, those are providers which are delivering on behalf of a higher education provider. We do have specified interventions we can undertake with those providers, but those are quite narrow, really relating to quality. So that's really relating to providing advice and assistance to those providers, or the commissioning of reviews in respect of quality. But because we don't directly regulate those providers, there is also an additional intervention which we have, is where we can issue a direction in respect of failure to cooperate. If one of those external providers does not engage with us appropriately, we have that up our sleeve to make them engage, basically. Okay, so in respect of providers who deliver higher education and which have specific course designation, now that will remain. Providers can continue to have specific course designation, although ideally we would want all HE providers to come onto the register in one of the categories. But if you do remain with specific course designation, there are a number of non-specified interventions we can undertake, and they're linked with our monitoring function, because we are not the regulator for those providers with specific course designation. We are the monitoring body, and we report to Welsh ministers. So ultimately, for those providers with specific course designation, the real power lies with Welsh ministers, and of course we can report to ministers if there's a problem, who can then take action themselves. With regard to further education institutions and providers delivering on their behalf, which if they're not on the higher education register, then there are specified interventions we can undertake in respect of quality specifically, and as with external providers, we also have directions in respect of failure to cooperate which we can use, and we can undertake other interventions linked to our funding powers as well. So for other funded tertiary providers, and that includes school sixth forms within that, we have specified interventions which really relate to quality. That's the key area where we can intervene. And for some of the providers, not in the case of school sixth forms, but for other providers who are not registered but are funded by us, we also have the directions in respect of failure to cooperate, and we can undertake interventions linked to our funding powers. But for school sixth forms, it's really quite limited. We can provide advice and guidance, and we can undertake reviews in respect of quality, and of course school sixth forms tend to generally be part of a broader school, and that we would liaise with Welsh Government and others as appropriate. And just the final type of provider I wanted to mention, and this is really those providers which are not funded by Medr and are not regulated by Medr. Well, there may well be providers who from time to time deliver tertiary education provision in Wales. Maybe they're from over the border in England and they're not regulated or funded by us. We do have, if there's a problem, the ability to go in and assess and undertake reviews on quality and provide advice and assistance on quality. Of course, because we don't actually regulate those providers, the only real levers we have beyond that would be to publish any findings, right? Because we can't actually, they're not registered, we can't remove them from the register, we don't have the ability to undertake any other form of regulatory action with it, but we do have some powers. So when we're thinking about engaging with a provider when something's gone wrong, we will always try, if we can, work in partnership with the provider where it's appropriate. But in terms of choosing the kind of intervention we want to use, we really have to think about being proportionate. As has been mentioned earlier, we want to be a proportionate and risk-based regulator, and we have to be seen to be reasonable. So in terms of deciding on the level of intervention, we have to consider the seriousness of whatever's gone wrong, who's impacted by it, what's the scale of it, and that might be to a certain extent judged by the number of people impacted, the level of public funding involved, the risk to the reputation of the sector, for example. We also have to think about the persistence of any issue when something goes wrong. How long has it been going on? Is it a recurring issue? And also whether the provider has tried to do its best to try and resolve the matter. Clearly, if a provider has tried and not quite got there, that's going to be an area where we're going to take probably less serious intervention than a provider which just doesn't want to deal with the issue. So the provider's actions are quite a key element there. We also have to think about the context as well. So what's happening more broadly in the sector? Is this happening across the board because the challenges out there? Is it something which is very much related to one provider because of the way they are acting? And we also have to think about the risk appetite as well. So clearly we would have far lower risk appetite for an issue like financial sustainability, for example, than a more trivial condition related to perhaps, say, the accuracy of the information on the register. Maybe it's not quite up to date. We would then consider very different interventions depending on the seriousness and the risk posed by the issue. And in many cases, if it's not that big a deal, we would just have a conversation. But we also have to think of our statutory duties as well. Medr has duties, for example, in terms of reporting to Welsh ministers in respect to the financial sustainability of the tertiary sector. So we will clearly expect providers to engage with us and work with us on that. Okay, I just wanted to say a little bit about the range of interventions. And this first diagram is in Welsh, and I'll just stay on this for a few seconds. But working from left to right, you have an increasing severity of intervention as the level of compliance gets lower. So at the left-hand end, you really are talking about interventions which relate to sort of educating and supporting providers, maybe providing advice and assistance. And as you go further to the right, you end up looking at things like specific, you're talking about registered higher education providers, for example. You could apply specific registration conditions. And more serious again, you could issue legal directions to a provider which can be enforced by injunction. And sort of the nuclear option at the right-hand end is for registered providers would be deregistration. And there are some circumstances where Medr actually has a mandatory duty to remove a provider from the register, and that will largely because the provider is no longer considered to be an institution in Wales, and it's no longer delivering education which would fit with the categories it's on the register. But there are, as I said before, non-specified interventions which we could undertake which don't relate to the register. And for those providers which are not registered, there will be a range of actions we can take, clearly relating to increased engagement, but moving forward ultimately to withdraw the funding if there were really serious issues with that provider. So we do have a spectrum of interventions, but we would always, where appropriate, try to work in partnership with the provider to resolve the issue. To clear?
Yeah, Pryna'n da pawb, Cleon O'Neill dwi, dwi'n pennaeth ansawdd at gwella'n parhaus. Hi everyone, I'm Cleon O'Neill. I'm the head of quality and continuous improvement at Medr. Just before I go into the quality framework, could I remind people to put questions in the question and answer session, because we have set aside about 40 minutes or so for that. So it'll be a very short session if we don't get many questions. Thank you. I just wanted to give you a brief overview of the quality framework and its application. It applies to all tertiary education providers, both registered and funded. I wanted to pull out sixth forms because they're in a slightly different position. We fund local authorities rather than funding sixth forms, so our expectation is that we will engage primarily via the local authorities. We are in discussions with ADU and with individual local authorities on request as well about how it might apply to them, because we're recognising this is one of the challenges in trying to develop an overarching system that applies to very different parts of tertiary education. As Ewan mentioned, the quality framework will come into effect on the 1st of August 2026. We will have further consultation, as he mentioned, in the autumn. At the moment, we have been talking to various sector groups on invitation, and if you are from a sector group, please continue to invite us. We're very happy to come and discuss progress with you. We're in the process of talking about guides on the quality framework for each part of the sector, and we're anticipating that we would do those in partnership with the representative groups to try and make sure that it represents how you think you can meet the requirements of the framework. And that's really important because it's about making you think how you meet it in principle rather than ticking boxes. So it's to try and generate that approach. So I just wanted to highlight that. In terms of the reasoning behind the quality framework, Tertiary Education and Research Act set out that Medr must monitor and promote improvement in the quality of tertiary education across the whole sector. It said that we can do this via quality frameworks, and we felt a single quality framework was the best way to take a coherent approach. We also have a statutory duty about continuous improvement. We don't have one on quality, so that's quite an interesting distinction. And our statement of strategic priorities, which was set out by Welsh Government, also includes a focus on maintaining and enhancing the quality of the tertiary system. But in terms of the design of the framework, we've been focusing on it delivering a consistent and good quality learner experience across the whole of tertiary. And that's what it's all designed to deliver. So again, we'll welcome your views on whether our proposals actually would achieve that. In terms of what it is, it's a single framework, as I mentioned. We've aligned it with our regulatory framework because obviously it's meant to work interchangeably with our statutory interventions and with our regulatory approach and so on. In terms of focus, we've aimed to try and be coherent, reduce duplication and minimise burden, which is again things like monitoring requirements and so on. We're trying to integrate those into a cohesive whole. We're aligning with UK and international approaches where appropriate. But we're very keen that the framework is adaptable to context, recognising the diversity within and between different parts of the tertiary education sector. It also needs to be able to evolve over time because, you know, as you've seen in the last 5 years, there's been huge change in terms of technology and its impact on education. There's likely to carry on being substantial changes, including in context and so on. Sorry, next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of how we plan to do it, we've set out principles and pillars. So the 7 pillars, as Stephen mentioned, set out the different areas that we are focusing on in terms of delivering that better learner outcome. Those pillars are based on existing commonalities across the whole of the tertiary education sector. We spent quite a lot of time working with the Welsh Government, QAA, Eston, and then with providers, including through the various representative groups. We've then set out actions for Medr and for providers, and we're very interested to hear your thoughts on those and how those might help support the delivery of good quality learner outcomes. In terms of our assessment of compliance, we've set out that we'll assess compliance with the framework based on the outcomes of external quality assessment, so QAA reviews and Eston inspections, data including trends, and then information. Information includes things such as complaints data and other contextual information we get. In terms of data, just to pick up on Paula's question in the chat, we have set out in this consultation on the quality framework the data we'll use in terms of quality, but we're planning a bigger piece of work on performance indicators, which will look at how we look at data more broadly, and that will include the use of benchmarks and baselines. We are working with HESA in the very early stages to see if they will produce some new KPIs for us for higher education, because they stopped doing that at the request of OFS, but we feel given the diversity in the Welsh sector, it's much more reliable to look at how we're performing on that UK basis. In terms of other parts of tertiary education, we do have benchmarks, and we're looking at how we contextualise those effectively, because as we set it out, data should always prompt discussion first before anything else is done. Our intention is then to produce bits of advice and guidance relating to the pillars to try and drive that continuous improvement approach, and then to set out performance measures, as I mentioned, within that broader consultation. Next slide, please. Sorry, continuous improvement. Sorry, you've done it already, Andrew. Yeah, the definition of continuous improvement is something that has come up as being a bit challenging for providers, particularly in HE. We've used the term continuous improvement because that's what's set out in the Act, so the terminology allocated to us, if you like. However, we are using it to mean quality enhancement. And in fact, looking at the QA's definition of enhancement, that does focus on continuous improvement. But we are hoping to put out a glossary in the autumn consultation, which will set out some of these definitions, and you'll have the opportunity to comment on those as well. So hopefully that will provide a bit of reassurance for those who've raised issues with that. We're focusing very much on where we can add value. So, for example, artificial intelligence is an area that people are interested in, and they've been asking, is there stuff we can do there? Well, we fund JISC and QAA to do work on that, and we feel that's probably where it's best located. So we're trying to do what only we can do best. So again, to reassure you in terms of burden and management of that, we're looking at taking a thematic approach to see if that will help drive performance across post-16 as a whole. And we're focusing on impact, so it's very much not activity for activity's sake, but it is activity to try and drive those improved quality of learner outcomes. We're very recognisant of the fact that it needs to be sector-led, but that everyone needs to be bought into anything that we implement. And then just to pick up finally again on sixth forms, we recognise they're also part of work on school improvement. So we're recognising that will probably be the primary locus of continuous improvement for them. What we want to do is link with the school improvement people to make sure we're cited and that we can make sure that there's good transfer of knowledge and explanation between the two. So if I pass back to James.
Diolch yn fawr, Cleona, and diolch yn fawr you and Andrew and Stephen, of course. You've heard plenty from us now, colleagues on the call, and we can see quite a few questions starting to come into our Q&A. So, please, if you do have any questions you want to ask us, now is your opportunity. We've got plenty of time. We've got about 45 minutes to go through the questions. So I'm going to start with the very first one that we received, and I'm going to come to Ewan on this, if I may. So, Ewan, how do you plan to train or engage with sections of the tertiary education sector who are less used to this approach?
That's a very good question, and we're more than happy to come out and talk to providers or to representative groups of different providers. I'm very, very conscious this will be the whole approach will be something for which certainly higher education institutions will be quite familiar, but for many other providers far less so. So yes, I think the key thing is we're happy to come and engage with you on the consultation. But if there are specific areas where you'd like us to come and give you a presentation or come and talk things through, happy to do that. So I would suggest that if there's anything you want to get in touch, drop us an email at regulationadvice@medr.cymru, and we will get in touch and we'll try and set something up.
Dr. Ewan, and I think Cleona obviously referenced Paula's question, which I think we've answered. I can see Paula subsequently posted in the chat welcoming the answer as well. So thank you, Cleona. We'll skip over that one, and I'll come to the question in Cymraeg, where somebody has asked, when will the register open and when can applications be made? I'll come to Ewan again, probably on this one.
So the register, we haven't sort of got a definitive date, but it's likely to be April. next year that the register opens. The register must go live, as in being published, once people are accepted onto it on the 1st of August, or strictly speaking, probably midnight on the 31st of July. So we need to have time for people to apply and to consider those applications. So I would imagine it's going to be early August or even end of March.
Thanks, Ewan. I think the next one is probably for Cleo. Can you please expand on funding in respect to quality? What will this look like?
Okay, I'm not 100% clear what's meant by this question. If it relates to continuous improvement, we do have a smallish amount of unallocated funding, which we will look to use for continuous improvement projects. However, we have a huge amount of, like, several million of our funding actually supports continuous improvement more broadly. All our teaching funding for additional learning needs and so on, learning teaching funding, and that all supports continuous improvement. So we're trying to design it in across the piece, if that is what you intended by the question. Thanks.
Thanks, Cleo. We've got a question here from Mark. I've just asked a colleague online just to help with that one around the practical question. So I'm going to come back to your question in a moment, if I may, Mark, around the online response to the consultation. So I'm going to come to Rachel's question now. Will Medr take a view of what it thinks the tertiary education sector in Wales should look like to meet the needs of learners and of society more broadly? And how is it envisaged the regulatory framework will help facilitate that vision? So again, I might just start with you here, Ewan, about how will the regulatory framework help us achieve the vision that we've set out for the sector?
Well, clearly the regulatory framework talks about continuous improvement, as Cleo has mentioned, particularly in respect to quality. But also in other areas like equality of opportunity, then providers will need to set measurable outcomes. So those will include areas, for example, reduction in attainment gaps between with underrepresented groups. So certainly the regulatory system is a means of gently moving the sector in the direction we want it to go. In terms of an overall vision, I mean, recognising many providers are independent institutions, most part, it's the governing bodies who are ultimately responsible for their strategic direction.
Thanks, Ewan. I wonder, Stephen, I don't know if you wanted to come in on this one particularly, or if you wanted to come in on any of the others, but just an opportunity maybe to again take a board perspective about how the regulatory framework will help facilitate with the direction of Medr.
Thank you, James. Yes, this is something that I think the board has been very interested in, because we kind of take seriously our responsibility to think not just about the performance of individual providers, but performance at whole system level. Is the tertiary sector as a whole best meeting the needs of Wales? And if you come at it like that, I think the board feels that since Medr for the first time is charged with funding and regulating the whole of the tertiary sector, there should be opportunities for us to do things better working with providers. For example, and perhaps most obviously, supporting progression by learners across the levels and across the different types of tertiary provider. Can we make it easier, simpler, clearer for learners to understand how you go from college to an apprenticeship, from college to a university, lifelong learning through adult and community learning, and a whole range of different ways in which we should be able to create clearer, better structured pathways for learners. I think the board also feels that when you look at whole system performance across the sector, as resources allow and over time, we should be aiming to increase levels of engagement and achievement by learners. We need to look very carefully at the proportion of young people who are not in employment, education or training of any sort at present. It's probably too high. We need to look carefully at the proportion of young people who are achieving level 3, the proportions going into higher education. So I think this gives us a great opportunity, really, as the board sees it, to look at those system level effects and work out what our priorities should be to be improving the ability of learners to progress and achieve across the whole tertiary system. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. Just to add, because I think it's an excellent question, Rachel. I think if I want to see a little bit about the long-term ambitions of Medr, our strategic plan is a great place to look. My favourite page of that is page 9. It sets out the long-term outcomes that we're seeking to achieve and our ambitions for what we want the sector to look like. And absolutely, those are underpinned by the work we're doing on the proposals in the consultation on the regulatory system. So thank you ever so much for that question. I've got one back to data. So I think this is probably directed at you, Fiona. To what level will the data be looked at? High-level data or at a more granular level?
It's a good question, and it's a bit of a mix. And for example, we're looking at completions data at the moment. We're looking at that at provider level, but then we're interrogating the data further, particularly where the high level data indicates that there's a lot of variation, to look at, for example, courses and areas and levels where there is reduced completion. Then we're trying to interrogate the context within each part of the sector to try and understand the reasons behind that. So it's quite a mixture overall.
Thanks, Fiona. I am going to move us on to Robin's question now. How do you see professional bodies supporting tertiary education providers in their specific sectors in embedding these frameworks? And do you have a means of connecting with the professional bodies and utilising these? Anyone fancy taking this? Looking at you again, Fiona.
Yeah, I can have a start at it. We don't have formal structures yet, but we are starting to set up arrangements. We've got an MOU, for example, Qualifications Wales, which has arrangements in place with the awarding bodies. So some of this we're leveraging through them. We've also got good engagement bodies such as HEIW. QAA then has a PSBA board, so we're engaging with QAA to try and drive influence that way. I think there's probably more we can do in that space, and if you have thoughts as to what we could achieve and how, that'd be really helpful to feedback. Thanks.
Thanks, Fiona. We're getting a raft of them around quality at the moment, so
That's all right.
I'll ask the next one. I'll see maybe if Stephen wants to come in on this one, and then come back to you if I may. So from James, thanks for the briefing, really appreciate it. Can you say a little more about the role and value of staff development in providers' approaches to securing quality? Stephen, did you have anything to say on that?
Sure, thank you. And I mentioned that this is one of the 7 pillars in the quality framework, and I think it's possibly unusual and even slightly innovative to say that an overarching approach to quality and continuous improvement needs to have deliberate regard to workforce development and the skills of the staff to do that. So I think this is a really important and powerful part of the whole quality framework. What we'll need to do is work with providers and their representative organisations and a range of other agencies and saying, well, is the current workforce development offer good enough? And if not, how do we need to work together to improve it? Because I made the point earlier, certainly the view of the Quality Committee is that we will not achieve high quality and high standards for learners unless we support the staff, both teaching staff and professional services staff, to do their jobs really well in the interests of learners. So I think it's a really important part of the whole quality framework.
Thanks, Stephen. Fiona, anything to add or?
No, I think just to highlight that it's set out in the Act that this is a priority, and we're doing big pieces of work on this to look at how we can drive it forward. And it would be helpful to hear from people as to how we can add value that way and actually try and do things in a cost-effective way that benefit the sector as a whole.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Fiona. And a question from Mark now. Oh, just before I go on to that, Mark, your practical question, I've asked our social research team to post the answer in the Q&A bar so everyone can see it. They're just working through the answer now, so that should come up in a moment. But Mark's question is a good challenge for us, I think. There seems to be considerable duplication in the quality framework and the role of sy'n. Reference was made to adding value, thematic approaches, and focus on impact as an example only. Can you assure us that the Medr role will not mean additional burdens placed on providers? Clear? Do you want to go first?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, and it's a useful question, Mark. What we're trying to do is streamline the engagement of Eston and QAA. For example, in Welsh Government, many thematic reviews, for example, were commissioned because different teams had different pots of money. So, for example, I think this year there were 5 thematic reviews, which was hugely challenging both for the sector and for Eston themselves. Our intention is that not every question should have the answer of thematic review. So it's actually trying to reduce the number of those that are held and actually working more holistically. In terms of themes then, and it should Medr wish to take a thematic approach to work within tertiary education, we could actually focus the thematic review on that. But we do need to be careful about burden on that. A sector-wide theme would be a huge amount of work. So I think it may be that we do things not through means other than thematic reviews. We're trying to work with Eston to give providers individual reports on any thematic reviews that they do undertake, because that will add a bit of value to that process. Because of course, at the moment they tell Eston stuff. Eston says, "Here's what you told us." So it's trying to add impact to that. But we're very keen on making sure we get proper join up and reducing duplication there. So I hope that gives you the reassurance you're looking for.
Thank you, Claire. I might come to you on that one in a moment, Stephen, but I'm going to give the quality framework colleagues a little break and come to you for the next question. How transparent will Medr be regarding the decisions taken about how and when to intervene?
Well, Medr will always try to be consistent in its decision-making regarding intervention. And there are some specific interventions where we actually have a duty to publish. So, for example, with setting a specific condition of registration, we would have to publish a notice, so that would be out in public. I think it really does, whether or not we publish decisions or information about interventions, really does depend on the context. So sometimes it's actually really unhelpful to put stuff out there. In other cases, it may be useful because it sort of shows areas for development and lessons learned, which can be reflected on by the whole sector and drive best practice. So we really do have to think of the context and how useful it is in the particular circumstances. But yes, clearly, whilst we might not publish every decision, we do need to be consistent. And there, as part of the formal intervention process, particularly in respect of registered higher education providers, there are decision review processes there, so we can be held to account. If people feel we're being unreasonable, they can challenge, and the minister appoints a panel of reviewers who can look at our decisions. So there are checks and balances in the system, and I think our first instinct would always be, can we work with the provider to resolve the issue without having to resort to sort of more formal powers? Because actually, though, using those powers can be quite time consuming. And if you can resolve it more quickly through a more streamlined, constructive approach, that's always the best way to do it.
And then thank you for the question, Victoria. Move on to the question from Ymgynghoriad. One of your strategic aims is to encourage greater use of the Welsh language, increasing demand for and participation in learning and assessment through the medium of Welsh. And how do we see this developing? We will talk a little bit about the conditions of registration and funding in relation to Welsh language in a moment. So maybe I'll just say something about the work we're doing on that later this year, and maybe you can come in on that at the moment. But I think the bigger picture there, and thank you for the question, is around the commitments that we've made in that strategic aim, which is particularly around the development of the national plan and the work that we're undertaking alongside the Coleg Cymraeg Cenedlaethol to look at what and how we deliver that national plan. So that's a very clear commitment that we've made to developing that plan for increasing demand and participation in the Welsh language. In terms of the regulatory framework, there are and there will be some conditions of registration and funding that we'll be consulting on later this year. But Ewan, anything to add?
Yes, so we are currently drafting a condition in relation to the Welsh language, which will focus on Welsh medium and Welsh language more generally, and that will support obviously the national plan. That's still quite an early stage, but we have an early draft. But that will be consulted on in the second tranche of conditions later this year. So watch this space, but we will certainly engage with people on that.
Thanks, Ewan. And thanks again for the question, Yana. I've got another, firstly, a thank you from Rachel. So thank you, Rachel, and thanks for the clarification. That's appreciated. So a new question, or possibly two. How will Medr decide on its risk appetite for each condition? And how will it decide on the risk profile of each individual provider? And will both of the above be communicated to providers? Start with you, maybe, Ewan?
Yeah, so this is work in progress at the moment. And if I start with talk about risk relating to providers, we are developing a provider risk assessment process. That's at quite an early stage, but we will be consulting on that later this year. And to be a proportionate and risk-based regulator, we want to focus our activity where it's most needed. We only have a finite number of staff, so we need to focus our activity where it has the most impact. And clearly, where you have higher risk providers, we need to have greater engagement. So we are developing that process, and we will be consulting on it later in the year. In terms of the risk appetite for different conditions, I mean, we have undertaken sort of quite an early stage assessment of the risk appetite for various conditions, but nothing is yet confirmed. Clearly, if I take an example of financial sustainability, you would imagine that we would have a very low risk appetite for a condition like that. Whereas some of the more procedural conditions, we might have, far greater risk appetite, because actually, if a provider was to not comply, it's not really going to cause that big an issue. If a provider falls over because it's no longer financially sustainable, that is a massive impact. So again, we're more likely to focus and ask for more information from providers on those conditions which are clearly a greater risk, and finances, governance, areas like equality of opportunity, for example, quality will clearly be those which, the kind of bread and butter conditions which we will clearly have to engage to quite a degree with providers on.
Thanks, Ewan, and thanks again for the question, Rachel. And it's helpful for me to give a quick plug, actually, for the session we'll be running next week on the regulatory framework, which will include the conditions of regulation and funding that we're consulting on at the moment. So if you would like to join us next week for a bit more of a deep dive into those sessions, you'd be most welcome. Well, the question and answer bar seems to have just dried up for a moment. So I'm just going to check in with Stephen to see if he had anything that he wanted to add to any of the answers he's heard from the panel, and just give everyone a kind of final opportunity if they have any questions and answers they want to ask to post them.
I might just pick up a couple. Firstly, Mark's question about a risk of overlap with Estin. Maybe we're saying that when we first set up the Medr Quality Committee, we invited Estin to be represented strictly as an observer rather than a member, but Jessa Scott, one of the Estin directors, comes along and is very helpful, very engaged in the work of the Quality Committee. And what that has allowed us to do is, I think, make sure that our agendas in the Quality Committee and in Estin are fully aligned, because we have a shared understanding of what Estin is identifying as key thematic areas of performance and improvement across the providers that they inspect. And we are then taking that feed from Estin to build into our own understanding as Medr of what it is we should then be prioritising in terms of trying to support continuous improvement. So actually, those discussions are going on a pretty continuous basis to make sure that we're not cutting across each other. On the contrary, we're building a shared understanding of quality and performance across the piece, so that we can then identify together what the improvement priorities might be. I thought I might also pick up Rachel's rather brilliant question, if I may say, about sort of risk appetite for conditions. One thing that we know we still have to do, it's kind of there in first draft in the conditions, but we know we need to do more on it, is be very clear about what does compliance look like against each of these conditions. It's going to be really unhelpful to providers if we kind of fudge how do we know whether we are compliant or not compliant with each of these conditions. So it's kind of pinning down as objectively as we can, what does compliance look like? If you're compliant, that's fine, no further discussion needed. But if you're not against the objective tests that we set, as Ewan said, we'll then want to get into a discussion about, well, what is causing this element of non-compliance and what does the provider need to do about it?
Thank you, Stephen. And I can just see my window refreshing with a new question. So I'll come to that next. I think this is probably one for you, Ewan. How will Medr familiarise themselves with providers? Providers are very different and have developed in very different ways since the Education Act 1992. It'll be important for Medr to have a detailed understanding of all individual providers in implementing their statutory duty. For example, SIN have general inspectors who undertake this role.
I just answer that by saying I think it's critical that we actually come and have conversations with you, and individually as providers, but also within your representative groups as well. And certainly willing to have those conversations. And I think the regulatory system only works when we have that partnership approach with you, and we have deliberately taken an approach where it relies to a large extent on yourselves as providers and relying on you to ensure you are compliant. So that relationship is key in that. So yes, I think we need to just come and have conversations with you and build a relationship. And I know many of my Medr colleagues are already familiar with you. I've had long history of working with you from Welsh Government. So but people like myself probably less familiar, definitely need to come and engage with you.
Clear.
Yeah, just to say the quality team have visited all FBIs and apprenticeship providers and HEIs this year. We're keen to have that ongoing engagement to make sure we understand the diversity effectively, because as I said earlier, any issues in terms of data or intelligence or anything else needs to prompt a conversation. So it's helpful for us to have that background to make sure that our discussions are actually informed by that, but by the diversity of each provider.
And maybe just to add from my perspective, I think one of the opportunities of working in a sector in a place like Wales is as a regulator is that we can work with providers closely and individually, recognising their different strengths, opportunities, areas of operation, etc. And I think it's been really heartening in the work that we've done in less than the first year of our operation to see colleagues from all across Medr go out and reach out to providers in that way, and long may that continue. It's certainly part of the ethos we've taken into the organisation to try and involve and treat everyone as individuals, as providers in terms of the approach we're taking to engagement. So just to reiterate that. We have another question, probably Ewan, but Andrew might want to comment on this as well. What considerations have Medr taken to ensure its regulatory powers do not overreach or do not compromise institutional autonomy, especially for institutions that have trusted or other complex governance arrangements?
I think in the design of the new regulatory system, we've had to recognise that we have a huge diversity of providers. Even within areas like higher education, we actually have far more diversity than HEFCO previously had to deal with. So we have to rely to a large extent on the governing bodies of those providers to get their own assurance regarding compliance, and very much place the emphasis on the institutions almost self-regulating and then reporting where there are issues to us. In terms of overreach when things go wrong, clearly there are checks and balances, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of decision reviews, but we have to take account of the governance arrangements of a provider when we engage with it. We are definitely not seeking to do anything which cuts against institutions governing documents. And we very much want to work with providers, as I mentioned before, rather than do things to them. So I think it's going to take time to feel our way with this. This is a new system, but I don't see anything in there which compromises institutional autonomy. But please, if there is anything you think of, feel free to respond accordingly.
I think the point is, is that we're still in listening mode in terms of this phase of consultation as well as the next phase. I mean, as Jane mentioned, plug in the 10th of June event we've got. We'll focus more on the regulatory framework, and for example, governance and management. One of the conditions that we look at there, so it might be worthwhile coming along to speak to some of the staff closer to the ground in terms of that condition there. But again, to emphasise, none of the way we structure our conditions at this point are intended to be prescriptive in terms of the variety of organisations and organisational structures and governance structures that we would that would pan the tertiary sector.
Diolch. I'm going to probably just do a last call for questions. I think we've got a couple that are just about to come through. And while we do that, just to remind everyone that the session today has been recorded and will be available on our website. Our consultation period is running until the 18th of July. And as you've heard, we're really keen to hear your views and perspectives on the proposals that we've put out for consultation. And I've just seen we've got a couple. So we've got two more questions, I think. But if you have any final questions for us, please do put them in the Q&A bar. We've got one which says, to what extent will Medr work and communicate with other regulators in the UK, e.g. OFS, SFC, to promote policy coherence and, where appropriate, convergence and to reduce the regulatory burden on providers? Ewan.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, we will work with other regulators. So not just education regulators as well. We'll work with the Charity Commission and the Competition Markets Authority as well, as appropriate. But in terms of the regulators you've mentioned here, the OFS and SFC, so for those who don't know, the Scottish Funding Council, yes, we will work with those regulators. And actually for certain providers, I'm thinking particularly the example of the Open University, which is it's an English institution by headquarters and it's registered with the Office for Students, but it will also be regulated to a certain extent in Wales, and we will have to work very closely to ensure that there isn't too much burden. So, but there are also other examples as well where we will need to work where there are arrangements which actually flow over the border, and you could imagine, for example, franchise arrangements across border where there will be implications. So we will work with other regulators, including the Department for Education in England as well, where it's relevant.
Thanks, Ewan. And we've got a question from Steve here, I think probably for Cleo. Where providers are developing collaborative, flexible and innovative tertiary education provision models, such as micro-credentials, as defined by QAA, short-form education, carrying academic credit, will all providers offering standalone or bundled stacked credentials be required to register with Medr?
Probably more a Ewan or Andrew question.
Okay. Ewan or Andrew? Or is that one going to require a little bit of thought?
Probably a little thought. I mean, my gut feeling, and we will take this one away. My gut feeling is if it's higher education provision, then it would need, the provider would need to be registered, but we can certainly take that away.
Okay. Well, thanks for the question, Steve. As you heard, we'll take that one away. I think with the questions that we haven't been able to answer today, we will just post a response on our website as part of the consultation, so you can see our views and perspectives on it. And it would be the last one that stumps us, wouldn't it? So typical of that. But great question, therefore. I think that's probably it in terms of the Q&A. I can't see any other questions that have come in. So I'm just going to check with colleagues in the room if there's any kind of reflections they wanted to make, having undertaken the Q&A, if there's anything they wanted to add to any of their previous responses. Doesn't look like it. So thank you to colleagues in the room. Stephen, any final reflections from you?
I think just say I've found this really helpful. Thank you to everybody who's participated and for all of the questions and comments. And please do keep engaging. I think we've all made the point that we are really keen to develop this whole regulatory framework in partnership with all of the providers in the tertiary sector and with learners and with the many other stakeholders that we have, so that we get something that works for everybody and in the interests of learners in Wales. So please do keep it all coming. The harder the question, the better, because that will make us think, and that's always a good thing. So thank you, and please keep it coming.
Diolch yn fawr, Stephen, and much appreciated your time this afternoon. And thank you to everyone who's joined us on the call. I think at the peak, we might have had 174 colleagues online. So, we are incredibly grateful for that level of engagement. We hope you found the session valuable. We hope you heard a little bit about the team who've been working on these proposals, straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak, so you could have an opportunity to quiz them on it. As Andrew and I have said, we will have another session next week. So if you are interested in attending that will be around the regulatory framework, particularly in the conditions. We'll be joined on that panel by a different board member, Chris Millward, who's been working very closely on the development of those conditions with the team. And I'm sure it'll be another really interesting session as we talk through our proposals for our new regulatory system. So, diolch yn fawr pawb, we're ever so grateful for your time this afternoon. I wish you all a fantastic afternoon. Hwyl